Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. I am in suburban Amsterdam right now. And a question I'm to address is how did a country so small as the Netherlands become one of the dominant powers in the early modern era and even to this day is still one of the most important centers of global trade? I'm going to break that down when I analyze the economic future of the Netherlands. The Netherlands has for centuries been one of the most dynamic economies in Europe. It is one of the greatest underdog stories in world history, both in terms of politics and economics. For most of its history, it was a marshy backwater that switched hands between the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs, and was briefly even occupied by Napoleon and the Romans. It didn't really start to catch its stride until the 17th century, since the break off from Spain and the Dutch War of Independence. The Netherlands has become one of the great countries in terms of international trade and one of the innovators in global capitalism. Fun fact is that the first stock exchange in the world was based out of the Netherlands. Amsterdam, particularly, is still the European capital of derivatives and options trading. The Netherlands is one of the top 5 countries in terms of exporters of food in the world, despite how small it is. It is one of the most advanced developed market economies in Europe and the world. What has allowed the Netherlands to be so successful in the past, and what is their economic future? The main driver for the Dutch economy historically has been its openness to markets and international trade. Even to this day, the Dutch pack a disproportionate punch with a current account surplus of 9% of GDP. They are a major exporter in food, specialty machinery, financial services, and semiconductors. Examples of really major successful publicly traded Dutch companies include Philips, ASML, ING, Rabobank, and many others. The Dutch economy really kind of at its zenith was in the 1600s when the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch colonial empire was able to compete toe to toe with much larger countries such as the UK and France, and were able to use their innovation of the stock market, joint stock companies, and other more creative forms of finance, develop its trade fleet and just expand and finance projects quicker than their competition. But once the rest of Europe was able to catch up, countries with larger population sizes were able to kind of push them out. They still maintained most of their colonial empire up until World War II, but they lost a lot of their control of the seas to the British primarily. But since World War II, the Dutch economy has still been successful. They had a post-war boom like the rest of Europe, despite having about 30% of their capital stock destroyed in the Second World War. They were the first countries to join what is now the European Union. They were one of the first countries in Europe to embrace free trade, mainly with its neighbors in Belgium and Luxembourg, and later expanded that to other parts of what is now the EU. They fortunately were able to find natural gas reserves in the North Sea to help with their energy needs. But now those are kind of starting to run out. They had a major gas boom in the 70s, which is really where the term the Dutch disease came from, because the ability to export natural gas at relatively high prices in the 70s made basically doing any other industry relatively uncompetitive. However, they did have reforms in the 80s to get a more diversified form of growth back. But in more recent years, in the 21st century, the Netherlands has increasingly become a knowledge economy with services focused on technology, particularly software, semiconductors. Current growth in the Netherlands is fairly slow, with a GDP growth rate annualized at 1.5%, but most of its other current economic indicators are quite healthy. Their budget deficit is relatively low at 1.1% of GDP. Their government debt to GDP is at 43.7%, which is very low, especially in the world where most developed countries have major sovereign debt imbalances. The unemployment rate is particularly low for European standards, just 3.8%, and inflation is fairly modest at 2.9%. The fundamental health of the Dutch economy is in line and fairly correlated with the rest of the EU, but it is in a much better stable place in terms of fundamentals than the rest of Europe due to having a generally more educated and skilled population and a more diverse base of its economy, which is a mix of agriculture, manufacturing, and knowledge work. The question really is, what are the structural things, though, that are going to drive the Dutch economy in the future? There are some major structural issues that could potentially derail the Dutch economy, and that one is a concern about a overly dense, aging population. The Netherlands is a very small country, but it has almost 17 million people, despite being about a third of the size of the state of Washington, which only has 7 million people. And that is despite being able to reclaim 17% of the land. Like, they've had a land issue and shortage issue for most of its history, which is why they've kind of been an innovator in reclaimed land. And 26% of the current land in the Netherlands is under sea level. As a result, they had a lot of dredging and specialized infrastructure to keep the country from flooding, and that is expensive. That burden is often placed on the taxpayers. And so that's almost that, along with a generous welfare state, makes it's why Netherlands has a relatively high tax burden, despite otherwise being a pretty free market economy. They also have a structural risk of running out of domestic natural gas from the Groningen field in the long run. Dependency on that is going to become an increasing risk, especially if they're going to have to rely on LNG imports in the future. The main other way where the population density comes, apart from energy strains and having to have high taxes to keep the country from flooding, is housing shortages and affordability issues. When you cram a lot of people into a relatively small area, particularly the Amsterdam metro and surrounding port cities, you're going to have a housing crisis. You can have public housing waiting lists for 7 to 10 years for a simple one bedroom. A lot of houses are bought on interest only loans that never get paid principal because it's just too difficult to afford a conventional mortgage that will pay off and gain real equity. The hope that people buy is that they could eventually sell the house for higher, and the equity difference just on appreciation will be the gain, even if they pay nothing down.
I'm live here in Amsterdam, and I'm going to be showing people around the city as part of my economic future video.
You have a lot of older people aging in place. Over 20% of Dutch residents are over 65 versus just 13% in 1990. You're going to have seniors be a quarter of the population by 2040. And the pension age is increasing, but longer life expectancy is increasing faster. And this aging society has dampened productivity to levels that are structurally low for the Netherlands. We're at the point now that we're pretty soon out of net of migration. Deaths are going to outnumber births. But then if you let in a migration, it causes a lot of social and political issues that leads to instability, and that doesn't really fix the problem. If the immigrants aren't a one-for-one replacement for the people who are retiring, then it's just going to create not enough replacement in terms of working age productivity to replace the retirees. Also, since a lot of the retirees bought their houses when they were younger, they're occupying a lot of the space and not downsizing to senior housing, which is helping clog the housing shortage. And it's also going to increase healthcare costs. But the main thing that's going to make sure that the Netherlands is successful enough is productivity and innovation. That's always been a strength historically for the Dutch economy, but that's going to need to keep going. And they're going to have to keep pushing in the next level in terms of new innovation to remain competitive, especially despite the EU regulations largely being a hindrance to that development. I'm in Jordan, the heart of Amsterdam. Amsterdam's main risk for the economy is trade. If you have a major reduction in global trade and an export powerhouse like the Netherlands, what happens to this place? Netherlands has built its whole economy on that, and they've been a leader in financial innovation, such as inventing the stock exchange and being still today Europe's headquarters for equity derivatives trading. Since the Dutch economy is so dependent on international trade, the other major risk factor is increased protectionism around the world. The US and EU tariff agreement of a 15% tariff on most European goods is not going to help matters for the Netherlands. They're probably one of the countries that has the most to lose from this because of two reasons. One, they have a heavy export balance. They export over 9% of their GDP, and their biggest exporter outside of the EU is the United States. So that's a problem for them. Second, if your other countries in the EU who are more inland or coastal areas are much further away from the continent, imports and exports that get distributed to the rest of continental Europe go through the ports at Amsterdam and Rotterdam. If there's less trade activity overall because of a slowing economy, because of tariffs, or people preferring to either buy stuff that is domestic, which is reduces export demands, or Europeans retaliate by either passing retaliation tariffs on America, which I think is unlikely, or just consumers who want to stick it to the United States, or buy less from America, and there's less overall international trade, and the world becomes more closed. That means less activity at the port, and that is really bad for a country who has built its business model on free and open trade. So we need to watch really the reaction for tariffs. And if the economy does struggle because of trade, it's going to probably cause a lot of socio-political issues that could eventually hold down the economy as well. Like I do in all these videos, is a comparison of the Dutch economy to a US state. If you had to match it in terms of GDP size and the size of the land, Illinois would probably be the best comparison because it has a good mix of agriculture and industry and services like the Netherlands, but lacks on the technology side that the Netherlands does. But we've already done Illinois for the state comparison in our South Korea episode. So instead, I'm going to compare the Netherlands to the state of Washington. They're a lot more similar than you'd think. Both of them have multiple major port cities and a body of water that is protected from the open ocean. The example in the Netherlands is Amsterdam and Rotterdam in the North Sea, near the Heigel and Bight. Whereas in Washington State, you have the Puget Sound with the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. They are both known for being innovative economies that have some of the largest tech companies in the world. The Netherlands, it's ASML. And for Washington, you have Amazon and Microsoft. And they're both socially progressive in their ideological views. They're also some of the least Christian places in terms of religious faith in their region. Like the Netherlands is one of the more secular countries in Europe, and Washington State is one of the more secular states in North America. And they're both relatively high in rain and pretty green places. But those are kind of more superficial comparisons. Let's compare their economies. Population in the Netherlands is 17.6 million versus 7.7 million in the state of Washington. The GDP nominally in the Netherlands is a little bit larger at 1 trillion, whereas it's 740 billion in Washington State. The GDP per capita in nominal terms is about $58,000 in the Netherlands versus 96,000 in Washington. There are 19 Fortune 500 global companies in the Netherlands, a lot of banks, a lot of industrial firms, some tech, and it's very diversified. Whereas Washington State has only five global Fortune 500 companies: Starbucks, Amazon, Microsoft, and Costco. I don't know what the fifth one at the top of my head. I don't think Nordstrom's global Fortune 500, but four of them are some of the most recognizable companies in the world. The main economic challenge is similar for both of them. That's housing affordability. Seattle is really struggling with this right now, and it is creating a lot of political problems and slowing growth. And it's the same with the Netherlands. Amsterdam is struggling with housing affordability. Core industries are similar, but a little bit different. They're both tech hubs in their region, and they're both big in terms of import export. Like Seattle is the closest port in terms of flight time to Japan and China from Asia. And it's not as close by distance via ship, but it's still one of the closer ports and the main export hub for natural resources such as timber, agriculture, and even some mining from the Pacific Northwest out to the rest of the world. And then the difference is that Seattle and Washington has a major retail that operates out of there. And as I mentioned, Costco, Starbucks, Nordstrom are big three, but there's many others. Whereas the main third real big industry for the Netherlands is finance. A lot of big banks such as ING and Rabobank. There's not really a big finance community in the state of Washington. Did we have an Analyzing Finance in the Nick tour stop there? Yes, we did. In the Netherlands, we had it in Amsterdam at the end of August, and in Seattle, we had it at the end of July. Both were good times. Do you think Washington is the right state to compare to the Netherlands? Do you think the Netherlands has a bright future or a stagnant future? My overall outlook is that the Netherlands is going to outperform the rest of Europe, but as Europe slows for several structural reasons, I don't see how the Netherlands are going to stay afloat when the rest of the European ships sink. So I think it's going to be slow growth, but it's going to be one of the better refuges within the EU infrastructure. Thank you all for watching.